Can a nation commit a sin so evil that even God refuses to forgive it?
We all know God is merciful. Throughout the Bible, He forgives murderers, rebels, even entire cities that turn back to Him. So why did He make one promise He never made about anyone else? Not to punish, not to conquer, but to erase an entire nation from history. Most people think they know the reason. They're wrong.
Because this nation wasn't judged for simply attacking Israel. It was judged for the way it attacked. The sheer brutality of their crime echoed through centuries. But to truly understand why this decree was so uniquely absolute, we have to go back to where the nightmare actually began.
Picture this. A massive population has just escaped Egypt. After generations of slavery, they're finally free. But they're wandering in a harsh, unforgiving desert. The heat is absolutely relentless. Supplies are running dangerously low with every passing mile. This isn't a seasoned, battle-ready army marching in formation. We're looking at exhausted families, children crying for water, the elderly struggling to keep up. It's a miles-long column of refugees stretching across the burning sand. The strongest are up at the front, pressing forward. But the weak, the sick, the tired, they're dragging their feet at the very back, completely isolated from the main camp.
They're completely defenseless, utterly vulnerable to the elements, and worse, vulnerable to anyone watching from a distance. Which brings us to a chilling realization. What kind of predator hunts in the shadows of the desert, just waiting for the weakest to fall behind?
They struck right out of the desert without any warning. They were called Amalek. But they didn't declare open war like a conventional army. They didn't challenge the armed men at the front of the column. Deuteronomy 25 records exactly how they operated. They waited in the shadows. They watched this massive migration pass by, and then they deliberately hunted the human beings walking at the very back of the camp. The stragglers, the ones whose bodies had simply given out. They cowardly slaughtered the absolute most helpless people in cold blood.
So why was this so different from ordinary ancient warfare? This wasn't a battle for supremacy. It was a calculated, predatory slaughter of the vulnerable, an act of pure terrorism against non-combatants. It leaves us with one desperate question. How would God respond to a crime this specific and this incredibly cowardly?
A line had been crossed that could never be uncrossed. Typical ancient enemies fought for territory, right? They fought for wealth, resources, political dominance. But Amalek's warfare was entirely different. They possessed no strategic goal. They just hunted human beings who couldn't fight back, preying on sheer weakness for the sake of violence itself. It wasn't a military strategy, it was a moral abomination. Pure predatory cruelty.
And the response to this was a chilling declaration, first recorded in Exodus 17 and cemented in Deuteronomy 25, a strict command to blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. This wasn't just a promise of future defeat, it was a vow of total historical erasure. Every trace of their civilization was to be dismantled. But that creates a massive problem. How does a vow of total historical erasure actually get carried out when the offenders slowly fade into history? The answer wouldn't appear until centuries later.
We jump centuries forward. Israel is no longer just a wandering camp of refugees. They're a sovereign nation. They have their first monarch, King Saul. And in 1 Samuel 15, God hands Saul a highly specific, inescapable test. It's time to finally execute the ancient judgment against Amalek, total destruction. The moment of final reckoning had arrived. Saul goes to war. He corners the Amalekites, and on paper, he wins the military battle. But then, he commits one fatal mistake that changes the course of history forever. He directly disobeys the ancient command. Instead of ending the threat once and for all, he takes the Amalekite king, Agag, alive as a prisoner. He spares the best of the livestock for himself and his men. He literally leaves a surviving remnant of the exact evil he was ordered to wipe out. The consequences are immediate and devastating. Saul loses his entire kingdom for rejecting the word of the Lord. But the real terror doesn't stop there. By leaving the Amalekite king alive, Saul set a deadly trap for the future. Because what happens when a ticking time bomb is left undifused? When you leave a single ember burning, it's only a matter of time before it starts a massive wildfire. The question is, when and where will Saul's failure inevitably explode? The story wasn't over. A generational ghost was waiting in the shadows of history. Generations later, we find ourselves in the Persian Empire during the events of the Book of Esther. A man named Haman rises to immense political power, and he becomes the architect of a plot to commit total genocide against the Jewish people, an extermination of every man, woman, and child in the empire.
But there's a hidden clue in the biblical text, a terrifying detail that almost everyone reads right past.
The text explicitly identifies Haman as an Agagite, a direct descendant of King Agag. This is the shocking twist hiding in plain sight. Haman carries the bloodline of the exact same Amalekite king that Saul foolishly spared centuries earlier. The nightmare had returned.
This reveals a terrifying mystery. Haman's plot of extermination wasn't just some random act of political hatred. This was a generational blood feud. The surviving ghost of Amalek rising back up to try and finish the slaughter they started all those years ago in the desert. Saul's disobedience almost cost his people absolutely everything. But looking at this repeating cycle of violence brings us to the ultimate question. Why did God command their destruction in the very first place?
Beneath the surface of these violent ancient texts, a much deeper meaning emerges, one that challenges everything we assume. This was never about blind hatred or unchecked divine wrath. Wars happened all the time in ancient history. Nations rose and fell through conquest. Amalek wasn't judged simply because they fought Israel in a battle for land. They were judged because they hunted the weak, because they deliberately targeted the broken, the sick, and those who physically could not fight back. Amalek represented predatory cruelty in its absolute purest form.
And the command to erase them? It was the ultimate act of drawing a line in the sand. A mandate to defend the defenseless, to protect those who cannot protect themselves from the predators of the world. It was a clear, unbending statement that taking joy in the slaughter of the weak is the one sin that simply cannot be tolerated.
So when you realize this unique, absolute decree was never actually about vengeance, but about establishing a zero-tolerance policy for predatory cruelty, does it change the way you see ancient biblical justice?